Welcome, everybody. This is Chris
Hello.
from History Dose and
And
Joe from History Dose.
this is Joe from History Dose.
Again, I am the writer, narrator of History Dose. If you haven't been on a live stream before, Joe is the artist, editor, and increasingly the musician behind History Dose. Thank you for joining. We have a very special guest today, Hikma History. He does the history of the Islamic world. So throughout the show, make sure to put some questions in the chat. We'll try to get as many as we can. The best way to guarantee that your question gets to is a super chat priority. It helps support the show, support us. This is just the whole team here. We got two people. We're related. And quick shout out beforehand. Remember, we are going to Ireland next year. So I put a link in the description about that. That's next September. It has all of the hits. I just keep saying it's a bucket list adventure. They take care of it for you. Go to Dublin.
And
Rocket
it
Canada.
is an adventure. It's not just sightseeing. It's like you're gonna feel like you're in a completely different world.
Yeah, I mean it's historical and scenic. Old abbeys, castles, villages. It's like you're hitting everything in one go. You got a little over a week
Beer,
there.
whiskey.
And the best part is all that stuff, all the in-country travel, the accommodations, hotels, tour guides, all that is set up by professionals. We're just along for the ride. The best part about the Mongolia trip, well, being in Mongolia, but the unexpectedly best part is it's just so cool traveling with other history lovers. So
Now we're
every
friends with a
conversation
bunch
is
of them
just
too. So
straight to Mongolian history, or all those tangents that your friends are like, "Hey, shut up! I don't really care about medieval history." No. These people like that. It's one big historical discussion
yeah,
over a pint of Guinness or
staying up
something.
way too late with a little bit of vodka and talking about history for 3 hours straight. It's actually
Yep.
surprisingly fun.
So you have like-minded travelers. You have me and Joe. That'll be September, and you can put a 25% down payment at the link in the description, and you'll lock it in. Got something to look forward to for next year. There's little sheep. I
Beautiful.
definitely have the copyright rights to all of these images.
Okay.
Okay, without further ado, Hikma History.
Welcome.
Hey guys.
Why don't you give a little bit of a rundown of what your channel's about and how you got into the subjects that you study?
Okay. My name is Tarek. My channel focuses exclusively on the history of the Islamic world. At the moment, in the future, maybe I'll have different plans, but at the moment, that pertains to basically 661 AD onwards, Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia, those kind of areas. How did I get started? I actually got started on Instagram, not YouTube. I used to commute to work from home in London, and I would get really bored sometimes of just listening to music or even reading. And I wanted to have something that I could do actively, if that makes any sense. Instead of taking things in, I wanted to spew things out, so to speak. So I just started an Instagram page called Hikma History and just made posts about the history of the Islamic world. And from there, it snowballed into YouTube. So yeah.
Hikma is like wisdom in Arabic. Is that?
It is. It is. I basically wanted something that was Islamic sounding, and more importantly, I've been obsessed with alliteration ever since I was a kid. So I wanted H.
I like it.
Yeah,
we have
missed out on that.
a question
HD.
coming in here from Jack Meister. Ask him what he recommends for beard care.
Okay, first of all, hello, Jack Meister. It's been a while, man. I hope you're doing good. What I recommend for beard care? I don't know. I just have a basic beard balm. I like the smell of citrus, so it smells lemony. I don't really look at the ingredients or anything of it, so that's about it.
All right, I love it. Yeah, somebody noticed. Like,
I have no opinion on beard
Hikma
care.
grew his beard. So
I haven't really grown it. It's just more lack of maintenance. I am well overdue a haircut.
You just need to act like it's on purpose.
Yeah. Okay, it's part of the plan.
I'm going for the not shaving look.
Yeah.
Okay, so I had a question to start us off, just from myself. I have some stuff that'll sort of push it along the way, in terms of the conversation, but there's a bunch of people that are probably tuning in and they don't know a ton about Islamic history. They are not Muslim themselves, so they're saying, "Why should I study the history of the Islamic world?" Because I think that's also a distinction in your stuff. You're not saying it's Islamic history; you're the history of the Islamic world. So
Essentially,
why don't you
but
talk a little bit about why get
yeah,
into this?
but it's a little contradictory because I only study the region once Islam has reached there. But yeah, there is a little bit of a distinction to be made. My channel is not theologically aimed in any way, shape, or form, nor do I have any intentions in the future of doing that. Why they should learn about it? Oh, that sounds like too basic of a question. Of course, you should learn about it, man. I mean,
This is a pitch
the
for your channel. This is
okay,
we'll put a
yeah,
big
yeah.
subscribe
No,
button up.
no. Because if you look at human history, there's been certain areas of the world in which human civilization has reached a very grandiose level. And when you look at the Islamic world, a lot of those areas actually come under the Islamic world. So, for example, Persia, India, the Middle, like Mesopotamia, Egypt, those kind of areas. So, on a grand scale, if you look at the historical ramifications of some of those civilizations, if we're talking about the Umayyads or the Mughals or the Ottomans, they have a very, very big impact on the world. So thereby, if you have a better understanding of that part of human history, you will just essentially have a better understanding of human history, if that makes sense. Because there is a lot of trade involved, a lot of trade with non-Islamic polities. There is a dissemination of information that's taking place. The House of Wisdom, everybody I'm sure has heard about that in Baghdad, 8th century Baghdad. So it's a very important chunk of the human story, at least the human recorded story.
Great, yeah. So one of the things I wanted to get to is I feel like there's this kind of vague idea, kind of like a popular history idea, that you basically have Islam comes to the fore, and at some point there's this golden age, there's science, innovation, all of these cultural achievements, and then it's sort of, I don't know, this is just the popular understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Crusades, and then it all ends with the Mongols showing up. So what do you make of that sort of standard account? Like there's kind of a rise and fall. What's missing there, and what maybe does that get right?
What it gets right, let's start with the positives first. What it gets right is that that is probably the most important part of the story. Importance, if we measure it through the level of impact it has on the region as a whole. Just the introduction of Islam in the first place is probably going to be one of, if not the most important contributions to the human story, so to speak. But what it doesn't get right is, and this is quite this is just a commonsensical point, is it stops the story about 800 years too prematurely. So the scale of the impact that Islamic civilizations have, you could probably make a decent argument that it gets diminished a little bit in comparison to the quote unquote golden age, but there is still a lot of things happening after that period. I mean, I would argue that the greatest, and I know this is a very subjective claim to make, but the greatest Islamic polity was the Ottomans, and they came about after that time period. And there are a bunch of other developments that take place as well, which might be region specific. For example, the introduction of Islam to the Indian subcontinent. Obviously, it happened before 1258, but they properly, most of the major developments that take place in that regard were after 1258. So if you just cap it right there, you're not really going to be able to understand at least the Islamic aspect of the Indian subcontinent's history. And then, last but not least, obviously, history is a bit of a butterfly effect. Things are built on one another, but it just stands to reason that the things that happened most recently will most likely have the biggest impact for shaping today. And so it doesn't take into account the modern period. I'm talking about the 19th and the 20th century. And if you don't study those 2 centuries, it's going to be really difficult to understand a lot of the things in the Islamic world, especially the Middle East, right? You have the very borders of most Middle Eastern countries were arbitrarily delineated in that time period. And so if you want to have a better understanding of the Islamic world, the way it looks today in the here and now, then you definitely need to extend your study beyond 1258.
Yeah, no, I think I was talking with Joe the other day, and there's always these reasons that people give for studying history, and the most cliche one is so that we don't repeat it. But which I guess is fine. You know, there's some element of that. There's some history that pertains to that, but a lot of the stuff we study has nothing to do with that. The reason why you and I study it is not, you know, when I'm studying how a Viking used their sword or evidence of I don't know, the marriage patterns of the Incas. It's not like it's an existential question that I need to know this. How did they make their maize or something? It's just, for me, it's not only just so interesting, but it's akin to knowing where you are on Earth. Like you should know your rough geography. And in a sense, I feel like Islamic history is so important to study just because, like you said, understanding where you are kind of in time, why things are the way that they are now. Why do people view the world this way? Why do they view it differently than you? And sure, like you would not, if you don't have that background of knowledge, you stop studying at 1258, you're going to be completely confused by everything else going in the world.
I agree. I like what you said. The way that I envision in my head understanding people, like individuals or collectives, is it's like a painting, right? So it's quite big, and if you understand their past, their heritage, and culture helps a lot in this regard too. It just colors in more of the painting, like more of the painting gets shown to you, if that makes any sense.
Right.
Just because I study the past doesn't mean I'm going to be able to understand everything about people today or societies today, but it just gives me a very good like chunk of the painting, if that makes sense.
Right. And I think also asking yourself why you think the way you think, you know, the what are the influence that act upon you, especially ones that you don't even know, you know, like you could be a historian who's not who doesn't come from Marxist historiography, but you are influenced by that. You definitely are. You know, just the distinctions that we draw or how we view the world, how we view the past is so much different than it used to be.
I think a big thing for me too is when studying history, like I've started looking into, I'm reading a book on the Plymouth colony preparation for Thanksgiving and stuff, but I like reading like the journals of people, and even though they're incredibly foreign, completely different worldview, I like when there's times where I can see myself in them or the way they think or something, or it just makes me in some way more sympathetic with people from, you know, 100, 200, 1,000 years ago, just being able to see myself and what they're deciding to do, the way they view the world or something. And then sometimes asking myself what would compel me in that circumstance to do something that those people did, or to think that way.
That's a good point. Yeah.
I want to give a shout out. We have a couple, the top tiers of our Patreon, Khan and leader tiers. We've got Benissimo, Kevin Lee, Omri, and Matthew Ochoa. Thank you guys so much for the support. And everybody else on the Patreon, link is in the description. I do have some priority questions from the Patreon Discord crew that I wanted to get to first. And then I still have some more of my own. Adam Yang, what movie / TV show has the most accurate depiction of medieval Islam? What do you think?
What movies are there? Medieval Islam. Damn. Let me think.
I come across so many like Middle Eastern reenactments and stuff. Like when we're doing especially Mongol ones,
Yeah.
there's always like some obscure TV show that I've never heard of, but it has like 500 extras and they're scaling some walls. I'm like, damn, this is really cool. I wish we had more of this on Netflix.
One that I liked, I don't know exactly how accurate it is, just because we don't have a lot of sources about it, is Ertugrul, the supposed, not supposed, he did exist, but we only have like just some coins, numismatic evidence about him. The father of Osman, the person who started the Ottoman Empire. I like that. It felt, from what I do know about medieval Turkic culture and polities, that felt quite accurate to me. I liked, to be honest with you, I liked the depiction of Salahuddin in Kingdom of Heaven as well. I thought that was pretty cool. I
He
thought
was the coolest character.
Yeah.
he was the coolest character, but it was quite nuanced. Like,
Yeah.
if you're a Muslim and you've been raised in an Islamic education, there will most likely, I will be willing to bet money, that there would be a hagiographic approach to studying Salahuddin, meaning making him to be almost perfect. But I thought that movie did a pretty good job of demonstrating some level of nuance, because he was just like any other human being. Seemed like quite a cool human being, but he had flaws and strengths and everything. So I think that movie did a pretty good job. I'm struggling to think of anything else, to be honest with you, because a lot of these, they're intended for dramatic purposes, right? For entertainment purposes. So I don't know if that would even be conducive to make it super accurate. I don't even know if that would be conducive to entertainment purposes.
Do you have a favorite film that features some heavy Islamic themes or something?
The ones that I have, they're not necessarily for English-speaking audiences. Well, I grew up watching Pakistan. I think they were Pakistani drama series about some of these things. About Al-Andalus. There was a ruler in the south of India called Tipu Sultan who fought against the British. So those were probably my favorite. In terms of the Islamic world ones, English-speaking ones, there aren't too many that come to mind. This is not part of the Islamic world, but the one that I watched recently that I was quite impressed with was Shogun. But that's nothing to do with the Islamic world.
That's a great show.
It's like,
yeah.
There's just good enough that even when they're bringing up medieval Islamic, you got to give a shout out to Shogun.
Dude, not many Muslims in that show. Terrific show.
Yeah,
so I'll get to the other one here. We got a super chat. Big fan of Hikma history. Very happy
Thank you
to
so
brought him
much.
onto the channel. Thank you, Hasib.
Thank you, Hasib. Hasib is actually a friend of mine in real life.
Okay.
Oh, awesome. Nice. That's cool.
He doesn't even have a question for you. He has such good some access to you that he doesn't need to. Tipu Sultan, I think I remember reading like during Napoleon's invasion into Egypt, he kind of had a goal to link up with him. Like, we will start this rebellion in India and stuff. And it is interesting because he kind of, as Napoleon is conquering, he's kind of trying to like upset all the British colonies and stuff, and you're like, I'm rooting for you here, but here is like
Napoleon had a bunch of contact with the Islamic world. Actually, you have Tipu Sultan, you have the grandson of Ahmad Shah Durrani in Afghanistan, the Ottomans, the Persians. He had a lot of grandiose ambitions in relation to undermining the British colonial presence around the world, to be honest.
I also remember reading before the Battle of Trafalgar, he had this plan that he would aid all of these Irish rebels in throwing off the bringing republicanism to Ireland, which honestly would have been pretty nice. But
Yeah.
okay, so this is a bit more modern question from Sean. I have one on modern Iranian history. After the death of Ayatollah Khomeini, there was some resistance to Ali Khamenei becoming supreme leader of Iran, not least because he was not a senior cleric. What did this dissent look like at the time? And do you think the same debate pops up when Khamenei passes?
So from what I know, there was a cleric. I have to remind myself of the name. Sorry. What was his name? Montasa. Okay, there was a cleric. It's going to take me a couple seconds to figure it out. There was a cleric in the 1980s who was essentially regarded as the successor to Khomeini, and he was very important because had he become leader, it's likely, not very likely, because not everything is in the hands of one person, but it's likely that Iran would have gone down a slightly different path because he was known to be quite moderate by Iranian Ayatollah standards, okay, not by Western liberal standards. And something happened in the middle of the 80s. I think it was on a policy issue where he basically got shamed and shunned and thrown out of the succession line. But in terms of how much of a difference it could have made, I don't really know, because obviously the person at the top is the one ultimately making the decisions. But already by that point, in order to secure the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the hardliners had been put in positions of power, right? So 1979, Khomeini comes to power, the Shah abdicates, Khomeini comes to power. And then for the next, let's say, 3 years, there is a little bit of a internal conflict within the Islamic Republic of whose vision is going to win. Is it going to be the slightly more moderate, a little bit more friendly with the West faction, or the hardliners? Spoiler alert, in the end, the hardliners won. So even if this person, whose name begins with M, his first name and surname begins with M, even if he had won, I don't really know how much of a difference it would have made, because he would have been surrounded by hardliners. And in terms of if Khamenei dies, will we see a similar power struggle? Potentially, because he's quite old, and as far as I know, there isn't any designated successor to him at the moment. So a very similar scenario could surface.
But is there a sense that there is, I mean, I think with all like the protests in the last couple of years and all of the unrest, could there kind of be like a pragmatic compromise that you want someone who's a little bit more, again, by Ayatollah standards, moderate, to sort of appease them? Do you think that?
Potentially, but from my discussions with Iranians who have a good amount of know-how on the ground and everything, the situation in Iran is not as desperate as certain media outlets in the West make it out to be. This is not a moral assumption that I'm making or anything. It's just important to know, because I personally think that once people reach a certain level of desperation, then you get to that point of no return where you can't turn back. So things are, for certain segments of Iranian society, things are bad, but I don't think they're that bad where they would start thinking about the prospect of a revolution on a mass enough scale. Of course, there's certain segments of society that wanted a revolution 20 years ago, 40 years ago, etc. And then the second thing to take into account is that the Ayatollahs have done a phenomenal job of enmeshing themselves into the infrastructure of the society, meaning whatever institution there is, they have designed it in a way where they hold all the power, ultimate power. So even if there is some level of protest, and over the past 15 years, I would say, we've seen at least 3 rounds of what I would consider major protests. The regime has dealt with them in a very competent way, leaving moral judgments aside for a second. So it seems like, as much as anybody might disagree with their politics, just from a pure competence level of being able to stay in power, how competent they are at delivering services to their people, etc., that's a separate argument. But just from staying in power, it seems like they are very, very good at that. So I don't know. And then on top of that, sorry, there is no leadership for the opposition, which is always a problem. So who's going to give a direction? I mean, I guess you could have a spontaneous mass revolution, but history has not been very fond to those kind of phenomena.
Yeah. Okay, so we have one that sort of goes a little bit more back in time, but sort of encompasses a lot of time. And I think this is relevant to a lot of people that are kind of, again, like a lay person who doesn't know too much about Islamic history.
Mm-hmm.
The difference between Sunni and Shia, and how has that evolved over time or stayed the same compared with the historical record? So why don't you kind of walk us through what is sort of a recap of what that difference looks like, and maybe how it has widened or closed over time?
Okay. So I try to stay away from theology as much as possible, but obviously with a question like this, that's basically impossible to do. So I'm going to just quick recap. The biggest difference, and there's many, by the way, but the biggest difference is essentially on the emphasis given to something called the Ahl al-Bayt, the family of the Prophet. So Shia Sunnis, after the Prophet passed away, there was 4 rightly guided caliphs. In English, we would refer to it as the Rashidun Caliphate, which is the one just before the Umayyads. And so it's in sequential order: Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali. So this is what happened, and Sunnis are quite happy with this. The Shias believe that the person who came last should have come first. So Ali came fourth. They believe he should have come first. He should have succeeded the Prophet, because the leadership of the Ummah, the Islamic community, should have stayed in the family of the Prophet. Whereas Sunnis believe that it shouldn't necessarily have done that. What happened was the thing that should have happened, which is a shura, a council, should have just got together of elders, a shura of elders should have got together and elected their leader. Whereas the Shias are not necessarily big fans of that. That is essentially, at the core of it, the biggest difference. Of course, we can delve into theology for days and days. Loads of things have happened as a result of that. But that's at the core of it. Now, this is actually a very interesting question, because the answer to this question is it has evolved tremendously. So much so that when I was doing my master's, I did my master's on a module called Encountering the Other in Medieval Middle East. So we studied the other, could have been anything, Crusaders, Shias, just different religious sects, just anything that's not considered orthodox or the majority, right? And when I was doing my module, my teacher made it a point to highlight that sometimes when you're reading some of these scholars, not necessarily theological scholars, but when you delve into their biography, it's tough to tell whether they're Sunni or Shia. So that gives you a lot of insight into just how big of a deal this was back then, right? So the point I'm making is that up until, I would personally say, around the Safavids. Are you boys familiar with the Safavids at all?
Yeah. What year was that again?
The Safavids come to power basically 1500 or 1501. I always forget. Around 1500, they take over Persia,
right.
And at the beginning, they are essentially on steroids. Like the pace at which they conquer is ridiculous. Then just 14 years later, they have a massive battle with the Ottomans at Chaldiran, and the Ottomans completely wiped them away, and then things kind of settled down a little bit. But they stay in power in Persia and a little bit of the surrounding territories of the neighboring countries for the next 230 years. And it's really in their reign that Iran, which is we can call it the headquarters of Shia Islam in modern day today, that Iran makes the complete transition from Sunni Islam to Shia Islam. There were definitely Shia Muslims in Iran before that, a vast number of them. But nowadays, if you go to Iran, the Sunnis are a tiny, tiny minority. And it's as a result of the Safavid policies to convert them. Now, that is very, very important, because it's only after that happens that the divide between the Sunni and the Shia become pronounced to the levels that people today are used to. Prior to that, I'm not trying to romanticize it for the sake of Muslim unity. There were definitely division. Muslim powers would go to war with each other, Sunnis with Shias, and one of the reasons that they would use to kind of, motivate them for the war, the Sunnis at least, and I'm sure the Shias did the same thing, was, oh, we're fighting the Shias, etc., etc. But if you actually kind of break it down, it wasn't anywhere nearly as big of a deal prior to, I would say, the 1500s as it is today. Now, the reason the Safavids did this, not to dilute or undermine their religious conviction or anything, but if we just analyze it from a secular, non-religious perspective, they had a lot of things in common with the Ottomans, right? So the area that they both emanated from was quite similar, right? Like Anatolia, Eastern Anatolia, Northern Iraq. The Safavids' power, at least in the early period, was built on the back of a group of people called the Qizilbash, the red hats or the red heads, because they would wear red hats. And they were essentially Shia Turks. And so a lot of their conversion policies or their fanaticism for Shiism could be understood, at least from a secular perspective, from them trying to make themselves different from their neighbors, which was very important for polities in general. And then moving on, so they converted a bunch of people, and then moving on into like present day, a lot of the stuff about Sunni Shia divide comes about, I would say, from like the 1920s, 1930s onwards. You have this is a lot of history. Okay, so when the Europeans go to the Islamic world and they try to colonize and they bring imperialism, one of the defense mechanisms in many of these Islamic societies was to embrace Islam as a political idea, right? This is where you essentially get modern Islamic fundamentalism from, modern Salafism, and to some extent Wahabism as well, even though Wahabism came just a little bit before.
Is that seen by proponents of that as sort of returning to a previous form that had just been lost, maybe? Like a previous political system?
Yes. So Salafism, essentially, if we dilute it to its most fundamental, is returning back to the most extreme Salafis. Maybe they would say on a material level, but most Salafis, they mean it in a metaphorical, philosophical sense, to go back to a version, quote unquote, of Islam, or an understanding of Islam that was around essentially at the time of the Prophet, right? Because that time is essentially, that time period is essentially venerated by Muslims from every perspective. There was justice in that time period. There was this, there was that. The system worked, etc., etc. But all of these things in the modern time period are essentially a reaction to European imperialism and colonialism as well. So out of that, people in the Islamic world becoming more and more bigger fans of political Islam, then the differences between Sunni and Shia Islam become highlighted even more. And then once 1979 happens in Iran, the Islamic Revolution, Khomeini and those guys, then it takes it to another level, because now you have revolutionary Shia Islam, which at the beginning, a lot of people tend to forget this, at the beginning was damn near hell-bent on exportation of their worldviews. So that's like and then obviously the people on the other side, the Sunnis, Sunni Salafis, etc., they have to react to that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So
Okay.
I guess the question I have is, so you basically have almost, I don't know if succession is the right word, but sort of a dispute in the beginning over who is the rightful heir to the rule of the prophet.
Yeah.
Does that not come with, like, are all the theological differences basically, I guess, incidental after that point, in the sense that you've sort of segmented, these two communities have segmented themselves based on that original sort of schism over who has the right to rule, and then a theology sort of builds out in separation, but it isn't necessarily like a Protestant Reformation where you have the schism is caused by a theological issue, and that is what defines those two communities.
Yeah, very nice point. Yeah, because it's been developed, that rivalry, the schism between Sunnis and Shias. A lot of people tend to forget that is essentially how it started. And that's one of the reasons why this is a very, very touchy subject for essentially everybody involved, from whatever perspective. Because there's a concept in Islam called fitna, which is, I guess, civil war, but it's just division within the ummah, within the community. And that's, I think, very smartly seen as a really...
Ironically, here's the comment from Al Muqaddimah.
See the beating.
We get it.
Okay. I hope you're doing well, Siawish. Just sit back and learn about Islamic history. Okay. So, yeah, that's a very good point. It's very different to the schism between Protestantism and Catholicism. And I should mention that from that original point, which was, as you mentioned, about succession, a lot has the two theologies have diverged in different ways as well. So, and for a very long time, we're talking over 1,000 years. So at the point that we're at right now, it's kind of tough for people to figure that out. But yes, it essentially started out about succession.
So was there a certain point, like, was it almost immediate that you then had Sunni and Shia communities, you had Sunni mosques and Shia mosques, or was that something that sort of developed over time where you would start to realize this is a somebody who preaches Shia and I'm a Sunni, so I will not go to that mosque or something like that? What does that
Very nice.
evolution look like?
It was the latter. Before I studied it, I thought it was the former, right from the beginning. The divide was very obvious, but once I studied it, I realized it happened over a pretty extended period of time, if I may say so. And the most important period, in my humble opinion, for that development was the one I mentioned earlier, the Safavids. Because even within Shia Islam, by the way, there's multiple, I don't know what the correct term for it would be, but like subsects, I guess, let's call them. And the one that the Safavids chose is called the Twelver. So that's the one Iran follows today. And within Shia Muslims on earth, they have the majority of Shia Muslims, right? But there's other ones as well that essentially predated them. You have the Ismailis, a little bit everywhere. You have the Zaidis and some other ones as well. But I think when the Safavids came about, that was the most important, apart from the initial succession struggle. Well, even though there wasn't actually a struggle, but apart from the initial succession, that was the most important time period for this, because one of the things that the Safavids did is they invited Shia scholars from all around the Middle East. One of the most important areas is an area that's very important right now, the south of Lebanon, Jabal Amil, where there is a bunch of Shias, and they invited them to Iran, gave them important positions of power, nice money, etc., all of this sort of stuff. And it's really in that time period that 12er Shia Islam gets crystallized. That's a good word. Gets crystallized, because you have really important scholars. What was the big one? Muhammad al-Baqir. I'm pretty sure I'm saying his name correctly. He was the big one who did a lot of work for crystallizing Shia Islam and what it entailed, its theological aspects, etc., etc. But yes, that's the very interesting thing. This rivalry developed over a the more I think about it, it's actually a very extended period of time. Yeah.
And I'm wondering, so like the 19th century, you have that struggle where you have like the Ottoman Empire. There's views of whether or not it needs. I'm sorry, did I cut out?
Yeah, you
A
cut
little
out
bit.
for,
Were you trying to say reform?
you cut out.
Yeah, reform. Like you have
The Tanzimat?
Yep, and what's the Egyptian traveler
Muhammad.
who went to France?
Oh, Rifa al-Tahtawi. I made a video about him.
Yes.
Yeah.
How much did the detention between Sunni and Shia come up with that kind of, those tensions of modernizing and seeing these Western powers grow and stuff, and whether or not you need to take a parliamentary democracy approach, or did those old kind of tensions between Sunni and Shia bubble up during that time period?
No, not really. That's a very good question, though. It did, in the sense of what I mentioned a little bit earlier, like secondhand, if we want to say, not directly, definitely not, but secondhand, where I told you guys, is political Islam became more fashionable as a defense mechanism to European imperialism. And then from that, like I said, certain more stricter versions, strict political interpretations of Islam became more popular. For example, modern Salafism, and then that paid more attention to the divide between Sunni and Shia. First, from a theological perspective, because by the 1920s, 1930s, obviously Shiism had been pretty well developed. Sunnism been well developed for a very, very long time. And so those Islamic scholars who also moved into politics, but were originally theological scholars, they critically analyzed Shia theology as well, and they saw certain points that they obviously disagreed with very heavily, and then from there it trickled into politics as well.
And do you like the young Ottomans kind of come out of that as well?
The young Ottomans are before that. The young Ottomans are the 19th century, late 19th century, second half of the 19th century. The time period that I'm really talking about is around, it's honestly the interwar years. If you want to be really generous, so between World War I and World War II, if you want to be really generous, you can extend it back to the beginning of the 20th century. But it really starts to form and metamorphosize in the interwar years, and then rises to the surface in a very violent, aggressive, alpha male way, 1970s onwards. You have the Islamic Revolution in Iran. You have the Soviets invading Afghanistan, where I'm from, and then the Mujahideen rising up. Obviously, the Saudis with their Wahabism and exporting that's going to play a role in it. And then obviously 20 years later, the long, thin dude who, the planes into the towers, all of that sort of stuff happens after as well.
So on the subject of the Ottomans, we had an interesting question from Afsharid beforehand. What's the relationship between the Ottomans and the Mughals?
Very interesting, actually. So essentially, they are both, from an ethnic perspective, even though this doesn't really mean that much because loads of other things happen where they intermarry into other cultures, etc., etc. But they are both Turks, right? And the first Mughal, Babar, the person who actually goes into India, he actually received some help. It's important not to over romanticize it, but he actually received some help from the Ottomans in the early time period.
And he was a direct descendant of Timur, correct?
He was a direct descendant of Timur, which is actually quite problematic because Timur and the Ottomans had a terrible relationship. They actually went to war. I think it's probably the most epic confrontation of two leaders in recorded human history, if I may say so. Timur and Bayezid, the Battle of Ankara, 1402 or 1403, I forget. But so they had some relationship. It was quite respectful. Even later on, 100, 150 years later, they would write letters to each other, very respectful, very nice. But there was a logistical problem in the sense that they had the Safavids slap bang in the middle of them. And then so that limited how much they could interact with each other. But from a trading perspective, there would have been a lot of trade. Because sorry.
Well, I guess, was there any thought of sort of material support of India when they were under British rule?
So Tipu Sultan, the guy that I mentioned, quite a prolific guy. He asked the Ottoman Sultan Khalif for material support, and the Ottoman Khalif basically said, yeah, but logistics and practicalities are very, very important in politics, obviously. And the Ottomans were too busy with the Russians mainly at that point for it to ever materialize in any sort of significant way.
I mean, it would have been a cool crossover, but they're too far away.
Been the coolest crossover. The coolest crossover.
Okay, let me hide current comment. We had another one come up here. What's your favorite style of Islamic architecture?
Oh wow, what a question! What is because I love Islamic architecture, to be honest with you. My favorite style. Let's make a quick short list before I choose one. Short list would be Andalusi, so Muslim Spain would be one. I would definitely put, I think it's called Perso-Turkic. So stuff that the basically Turkic dynasties built in Iran would be second, and then Ottoman would be third. Although I do quite like Mughal as well. You know what? Nah, I'm not gonna do that. I would probably say Perso-Turkic, to be honest. Have you guys ever heard? Sorry, boys, which one of you is the artist? I always forget.
Joe is.
Joe, have you ever heard of something called Mokarnas?
I don't think so.
Dude, if this doesn't blow your mind, I'm going to be disappointed. Do you have access to Google right now?
Yeah.
Go ahead and do yourself a favor.
M-U-K? M-U-K?
No, sorry, M-U-Q, pardon me.
Q?
A-R-N-A-S.
N-A-S. Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
Dude.
Chris, can you bring that up on the stream? Just the Google image search?
Spell it again.
M-U-Q-A-R-N-A-S. Wow.
Cardinals.
Dude, when you see these in real life, it just it almost annoys me how nice they look.
Okay, we need to come up with a new video topic just as an excuse to sneak one of these in.
Are these look like Andalusian? Is that?
No,
are they kind of all over the place, or is it?
It's mainly Perso-Turkic. So
Wow.
Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia. Timur and his family loved these. They were obsessed with them. It's like honeycomb.
Oh man,
But
the geometric perfection is.
There you go. So very nice, Joe. You read my mind. I don't think they're perfect, but when they build them, there is geometric rationale for them. Like there are actual equations as to how cavernous, how deep each little honeycomb should be, and then the position of each one. It's not just random. They've figured out an actual formula of how to make it look aesthetically pleasing. And this is actually quite interesting, boys. I'm sure you might know this, or you might have come across it. You know, in Islam, it's I'm pretty sure it's forbidden. I don't know if it's forbidden, but because there's a distinction in Islam between forbidden and frowned down upon. But it's one of those two where you're not really supposed to recreate human form. You know,
Yeah, icons is
iconography.
Figurines and icons. Yeah.
So I find it very interesting from an anthropological perspective how the lack of focus on that forces them to take the non-iconographic art to a level which, with all due respect to European civilization, and I'm a very big fan of Gothic architecture, actually, you just don't see that anywhere else. Like the
that's a good
detail to
point.
the minarets, to the domes, to these kind of things, the muqarnas, the geometric patterns and everything.
Yeah.
I just find it interesting anthropologically how I'm sure it's connected to the fact that your creative impulses are negated in one direction, so that when they go in this direction, they're taken to a different stratosphere.
Yeah, I've been reading some history on the Puritan separatists from the Church of England, and one of the things that they did from time to time was going to these cathedrals, bust up the organs, destroy the arts and stuff.
The organ seems like overkill. That's an icon.
Yeah.
Oh, I think I cut out again.
No, you seem good.
Am I pausing?
No, you're fine.
No.
Okay. On my screen, I cut out for a second. And then, the Puritans eventually have these kind of bare bones congregations, these gatherings. There's no really art or anything. And I kind of like how Islam is doing the same thing where they don't have idols or figurines, but they're like, we still want to worship in a beautiful way. So we're going to go with geometric and mathematical beauty, which is just like,
I feel like the Puritans didn't have that, though.
Yeah, the Puritans didn't really have any.
They put all their energy into economics.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Puritan work ethic.
And how did it turn out for them?
They did a pretty good job. You got a tiny little country in the Netherlands. Damn near. They did some great stuff in history.
So I had a question come in here from Christopher Polanski. Says he is a colonial imperial era historian. He's curious if there was ever an institutional push to pursue colonialism by Islamic empires similar to Western empires. So I wonder if there's a distinction to be made there. Like there are obviously conquests by Islamic rulers and perhaps spreading Islam as part of that. But it seems like his question is concerning almost like later Western colonialism, which also, is sort of, I guess you would call it maybe a 17th century phenomenon.
Right.
16th century too.
I'm not, sorry, what was his name?
Christopher Polanski.
Christopher, I'm not 100% sure if I understand your question, but I'm going to give it a crack. In the beginning, when Islam is spreading, right at the beginning, from the Prophet's time until, when would I cap it? I would probably cap it at the Umayyads, just before the Umayyads fall in the 740s. Obviously, Islam is the Islamic Empire, the Caliphate, the Khilafah, is growing very, very fast. At that time period, I would probably, if you wanted to apply that term, colonialism, because in my head, I've been trained almost to associate it with the 17th, 18th, 19th century European phenomena. That would probably come under that term. But there's a couple of things to bear in mind in that there are some distinctions between later European colonization and the early Islamic ones.
He did just add an addendum. He said, it did mean more of a 16th and 18th century sense, similar to European colonialism in the West. I'm wondering if there's any push by major Islamic powers to engage in settler colonialism. So not simply imperialism, but let's move people from our country and sort of have it's a colony acting on behalf of our government there.
Very nice. Thank you for clarifying that, Christopher. 16th to 16th century, definitely yes. 17th century, I would say a little bit less, but still yes. 18th century, yes, but very little. And a lot of it, what comes to my mind, I would probably say is the Ottomans, right? So if you guys have a visual image in your head of the Ottoman Empire, they went to the Balkans, the Middle East, like Levant, Middle East, a little bit of the Arabian Peninsula, and then North Africa, right? So when they would rule these areas, a lot of the times, especially in the beginning, they would have representatives from the natives ruling for them on their behalf, right? And there was different levels. There was a distinction to be made about the status of a certain territory, whether it was directly ruled by the Sultan, the Sublime Porte, the government as it was known, or it had more of a vassal status. But when they would send people there, for example, in Algeria, I'm pretty sure, I forgot the term of it now, Koulouri, I just remembered it. They would have people that ruled Algeria who were workers for the Sultan. And then obviously, as a man, you don't really want to be away from your family for too long. So they would bring their family with them. And then those people would stay there because the journey from Algeria to wherever they were from in Anatolia, most likely, or the Balkans, would be quite long. They would stay there and they would become naturalized Algerians over a long enough period of time. And this wasn't just in the case of the actual leaders themselves. Anybody that was an administrator would essentially do the same thing. So that's what comes to mind straight away. If you extend it just before that, just prior to the 16th century, there was that happening a fair amount, especially in the Balkan areas. When the Ottomans move into the Balkans, they actively asked ethnic Turks, to go there and settle down. And then now, over a long enough period of time, they are from Bulgaria. They're considered Bulgarians, Bosnians, etc., etc.
Yeah, so does that relate to this question we had come in from Errold? How did Albania and Bosnia, majority of the population, become Muslims and not other European territories that the Ottomans conquered? Was that the distinction, maybe? Is that there was less
I think that was
land
part
settlement?
of it. Another part of it is some of those other territories were very, very, very proud and defiantly proud of their Christian heritage. I'm thinking of Serbia specifically, and maybe Bulgaria as well. Even though I don't think they live there now because they did a population exchange when Turkey got established in the 20th century. But there was a decent minority of Bulgarian Muslims as well. And then also Sufis. I'll be completely honest with you boys, I haven't delved into this particular question too much, but I do know that. Do you guys know what Sufism is?
I know of it.
Islam.
I'm familiar with the term, but you'd have to give me a rundown of the basic tenet.
It's just two words: mystical Islam. They're Muslims who focus a little bit more on the mystical aesthetic aspect of Islam. You can make I feel like they're not even a different sect of Islam, because I'm pretty sure you can be a Sufi Sunni, or I don't know about Shias, but I'm assuming a Sufi Shia would also make sense. But for some reason, Sufism, especially, I think it's called, because Sufism has different orders where you go in the Islamic world. The one in the Balkans that's quite popular is called Bektashi. In Albania, and I'm pretty sure in Bosnia too, that became super popular there as well. So I think that played a role in it. Beyond that, I can't really comment too much.
I'm wondering as well, how much because in the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire, isn't there like an attempt to cultivate a national identity?
Nice, yeah. Ottomanism.
Did that kind of tie into maybe that question of how much are they attempting something similar to those Western colonial powers? Was that something that they saw them doing and was like, okay, let's attempt that ourselves?
Very nice, Joe. You got good common sense, because that's exactly what it was. In the 19th century, and then I would say the 20th century too, honestly, I feel like a lot of the Islamic world has only really snapped out of that probably in the last like 2, 3, 4 decades, if you want to be real generous. Essentially from Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, so like late 1790s, to about the 1970s, on a mass scale. I'm not speaking on behalf of ordinary people, but on a mass political scale, one of, if not the main developments or themes in the Islamic world was, how do we become more European-like? And the reason for that is because of how powerful Europe was, right? So that's exactly what Ottomanism was. I have said this for a few years now. I need to be careful how I say this. You guys know, the concept of a nation state. There's a good reason why it came out of Europe, I personally think, because it makes sense in Europe. A lot of the legwork required for you to finally come out and say, hey, we're going to have this model called nation states, was already done for Europe, mainly in the shape of wars with their neighbors, etc. A lot of the religious differences, what's it called? What was that conflict called in Europe? 150 years, Catholics and Protestants?
Yeah.
The Reformation?
Yeah, but I think there was a war. Basically, from like Martin Luther's time to the Peace of Westphalia, 1648. A lot of those things had been stamped out and ironed out, in Europe. Whereas the model of the nation state, whilst I'm not telling anybody to eschew the nation state model because it seems like it's the only one that's feasible in the modern world, you can make a very good argument that it doesn't make as much sense in many regions of the Islamic world for a variety of different reasons. One of the main ones is honestly diversity. If you look at a tiny little country like Lebanon, and boys, if you ever want a headache in your life, just try to demographically break down Lebanon, and you will see just how, not impossible, I like saying nothing in life is impossible, but you'll realize just how difficult and almost abnormal and unnatural and inorganic a nation state model is to Lebanon. You've got Sunnis and Shias, you've got Greek Orthodox Christians with Maronite Catholic, you've got Arabs, and then you've got other people that are Arabs, but they say they're not Arabs. You've got this, that, the difference between this group of people and that group of people.
But the Ottomans tried to do that, right? They tried to make, like, if you were a Christian, you could still be a citizen, or you were a Jew, right?
Very nice. But at that early point, they hadn't, a lot of these political thinkers in the Islamic world, they didn't realize that, this doesn't necessarily apply to me so much. The only reason I can sit here as an armchair philosopher and say this is I've got hindsight on my side to kind of give me some evidence for that. So that's exactly what the Ottomans tried to do. They tried to modernize, even from like a cultural perspective. They didn't completely suck Islam out of public life, but they did a whole bunch of stuff, policies and reforms that basically diminished, let's just use that word, diminished the role of Islam in society, in public life, because they saw the Europeans moving towards secularism, and they thought, they've got big warships that we stand no chance with. That's probably the reason why they're so strong, is because their entire approach to scientific progress, so to speak. So let's just try to be like them. And
is there a parallel here, maybe about, I think it's the Dar al-Islam, the idea of sort of like kind of united Muslim lands, like the sort of corridor of peace, I guess. But historically speaking, you would have had, in theory, a caliph that ruled over everything. That, more and more it just became sort of a figurehead. I think by like, you think about like late Abbasid era where like the Abbasid caliph is the caliph, but like we don't really need to do what he says. And so you have that sort of like sectarianism. Is there a parallel there with Europe in the sense that after the Protestant Reformation, you have less and less influence of the Pope over things? So now that you even, you could say that just historically speaking, kings would maybe pay deference to the Pope, even if they were going to sort of do their own thing.
Yeah,
Is there a parallel there that you kind of lose your major figurehead, your major uniting figurehead, and it makes it much easier when you don't have some sort of like central figure that you need to pay homage to. Makes it much easier to say, okay, well, what are we rallying around? We're rallying around our current monarch in our identity here.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I would say, Chris, that it was not as much of a consideration by the 19th century, because a lot of that had just naturally, it had nothing to do with European colonialism or imperialism. That had just naturally kind of happened already as well. So centralized administration, which is essentially what you're talking about, one person at the top. In the Ottoman Empire, at least, I mean, after about the beginning of the 17th century, and you could probably make a good argument towards the end of the 16th century as well, after Suleiman the Magnificent, there was a very definite direction in where central authority was going, and it was not up, it was declining. So already by the 19th century, I definitely wouldn't say that the Khalif had been relegated to just a figurehead, in the way that, I mean, Queen Victoria had a cheeky bit of power, but it wasn't the same as like some of these European powers where it was straight up a figurehead. But that process had already kind of taken its course in the Islamic world. So from that perspective, not so much. It was more from like, I think Joe mentioned, or somebody in the question mentioned this, on an institutional level, like parliaments. Parliament became a much more important desire for political reformers in this time period, and it was straight up because they saw the Netherlands, Britain, I'm assuming France, but France had an emperor and then not an emperor, etc., etc. All of these European powers having them, and so they tried to replicate the same model.
So I wanted to switch gears here and talk about, I recently watched your video on the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which I feel like is kind of relatively unknown about these days. It's, we kind of think Afghanistan, we think the American war in Afghanistan. But this kind of lays a lot of the groundwork for that. But the thing I was really interested in watching is that you kind of have this relationship between the Soviets and Afghanistan as Afghanistan beats the British again. And you're kind of this, not reconciliation, but this growing alliance between them. And I think at some point
Britain and Afghanistan?
No, between Russia,
the
Soviets in Afghanistan after the Bolshevik Revolution. And it seems like by the mid 20th century, then you have this sense that it's more like the Soviets are kind of, I don't know if a puppet might not be the right term, but they are kind of more playing their hand in Afghanistan and making sure that they have a good communist in power there. And then you have, after the invasion, you have this kind of like religious or semi-religious mujahideen movement against that. But I was curious, so what is the relationship between Afghan communism and Islam? Because it seemed like for at least, before 1979, 1980, you have decades where you have communists that exist in Afghanistan with apparently some level of comfort and some representation. You might have resistance to collectivism, but how do you have an ideology that I guess we would think of this as a deeply religious society, but then you have an ideology at the top that is, at least in theory, very secular and against religion. So how did that exist in Afghanistan before the invasion?
Very good question, Chris. I like the question. That war is very personal to me as well, because like I mentioned, I'm Afghan and I was born just after the Soviets pulled out, and I've spent a lot of time studying it. So essentially, what happened was, I got to give you a little bit of context just before that. the whole Islamic world, as a result of their experience with European imperialism, realizes it needs to get stronger. And they all reach a consensus. The only way to get stronger is this magic word beginning with M, modernization. We need to modernize. Okay. And there's two, I basically classify into two categories. There's social modernization and then material modernization. Material modernization is inanimate objects, technology, machines, etc. And then social modernization is ideas, essentially, right? So when the Afghans get independence, complete independence from the British, they slowly but surely chart a course for themselves where they realize we need to modernize and modernize fast because we are weak. And if we're weak, we are at the prey of outside forces. So they do that in a bunch of different ways. One of the ways they do that is they set up European language schools. They got a Dutch one, a German one, a French one, and an English one. And then another thing they do is they send out students. This is very important. Pay attention to this part. They send out students abroad to England, Germany, and France. And then when World War II finishes, obviously you have the Cold War, America and the Soviet Union. They are essentially competing with each other for the world's support, right? And Afghanistan, the people who ruled Afghanistan at that time, which was a monarchy, thought it was a brilliant idea. Let's play them off against each other. So the king would send students to America, but the king would also send students to the Soviet Union. And then those students would come back to Afghanistan, and they had obviously been influenced by their new settings, and they brought the ideas that were in vogue in those settings back with them. In the Soviet Union, communism; in America, democratic capitalism, I guess you want to call it. So that was that. Now, to directly answer your question, Chris, it is very important to remember that these people were an absolutely microscopic, tiny, tiny portion of the society. And when I say microscopic, I really, really, really mean microscopic. Like in terms of the total population of the country, they were essentially people who had been sent to the Soviet Union, who were, first of all, literate. Illiteracy was rampant in the mid-20th century in Afghanistan. So a lot of people wouldn't even necessarily have had access to communist, Marxist pamphlets, books, etc., etc. And it was essentially the elites, the people who had the luxury of being able to read and write.
It was very ironic.
And that's
only the elites are communists.
Exactly. Which is why which is why it's such a good question you ask, because Afghanistan is a very deeply Islamic country. Like it's very proud of its Islamic heritage, of its Islamic religion and everything. And most people, I would argue, in Afghanistan now, because when a little bit of time goes by, time is the greatest healers, they say. People nowadays look at Saddam Hussein as, oh, he wasn't so bad, etc. But when the communists took over in Afghanistan and the Mujahideen rose up, nowadays some people, for whatever reason, try to portray them as, oh, this was only the super religious people in the country. Boys, it was massively popular. Like most of Afghan society just looked at the Afghan communists as outsiders, even though they were Afghans, because it doesn't mesh with Afghan culture. The most obvious point is on Islam, right? Communism, at least from a theoretic point of view, what's that famous axiom? Opium is the religion is the
opium of the masses.
Religion is the opium of the masses. Thank you. But even from a cultural perspective, in relation to women, in relation to the family, in relation to ownership of land, all of these things, they were just at the complete opposite of what Afghan culture taught them for thousands of years. So they were massively unpopular, massively.
So if I can expand the scope here, because we had a very similar question come in but not focused directly on Afghanistan. What is the influence of Marxism on Islamism and Muslim societies? It's hard not to see the influence when you look at Iran's constitution after 1979, but I don't know how unique that is.
What is the Chris, just read that the first half of that to me again, please. What is
the influence of Marxism on Islamism
Okay.
and Muslim societies?
This is a very cool question. And the reason for that is I feel like this is often misunderstood. There is a very, in historical senses, like in the last 60, 70 years, this might surprise people, but there is a relationship between those two ways of thinking. But there's something to bear in mind. In Islam, the theology, the religion itself, there are loads of aspects which, with a modern brain, we would categorize, or if not categorize, we would say, oh, that reminds me of socialism a lot, in relation to welfare, mainly. Yeah, like the duty of a ruler to fulfill certain needs of the people. Obviously, in the 7th century, there was no term for socialism. It's quite a modern term, so they didn't call it that. But if we're looking at it today, we could very well make that assumption. And so I mean to say that, to first say that they are not as unnatural of an alliance as you would initially think, considering that famous axiom, religion is the opium of the masses. Secondly, because communism and Marxism and left-wing ideologies, especially in the 1970s and 60s and 50s, was quite a popular ideology in the Islamic world. Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. Saddam Hussein is technically a socialist. He's from the Ba'ath Party, from the Ba'ath Party, and they are Arab socialists.
And he starts out more secular than he ends up becoming, I believe.
Yeah. Saddam Hussein's a hilarious guy, but whatever.
At some point, you get a Quran written in
his
Saddam
blood,
Hussein's blood.
which
It's
is
like,
great. I think even from an Islamic point of view, that's a bit crazy. I'm not gonna lie. But anyway, whatever. Saddam was a weird guy. But the point I was trying to make is that these two ideologies, considering that they were quite fashionable in that time period we're talking about, 50s, 60s, and 70s, they're not as antagonistic, or they do make sense when they comes together. And there are some thinkers. I feel like the guy who asked this question, he's probably thinking of a very specific guy who was very important in the Islamic Revolution in Iran, died just before it. He studied here in the UK, actually. Ali Shariati, he's known as the Red Mullah, I think. But he did a lot of work, theoretically, trying to marry Marxism together with Islamism. And one of the main reasons was it was essentially like a marketing job, because some of these thinkers knew that left-wing ideas or ideologies were quite popular in their societies. They wanted to incorporate them into their movement as well. And by telling them, look, this thing that we're espousing, Islamism, let's just call it, in whatever capacity it is, it gives you guys what you guys are interested in too, left-wing, focusing on the proletariat over the people at the top, etc., etc. It gives you guys expression as well. So that's some context. I don't fully remember the question. I hope that answers it.
Well, and he was also asking about Iran's constitution after 1979. So was there a point to play there? Is there actually sort of a Marxist element to the Iranian regime?
I'm going to be hold up my hands. I did study it recently because I had a video on the Islamic Revolution. I don't fully remember the Iranian constitution, but I would really emphasize that point that I made, that even if they frame it in Marxist terminology, Islam itself, right, what Islam is at its theological conception, already gives a lot of expression to left-wing concerns. So even if you do see that, don't be so quick and hasty as to say, oh, that's Marxist influence. Maybe I'm not saying that it's not either, maybe, but just bear that in mind too, just to make it a little bit more complicated for you. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I also thought it was interesting during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. You have this. I think you mentioned Iran, and this is post-revolution. Iran is supporting the Mujahideen, and
Yeah.
so is the West. And it was like,
Mhm.
what do you need to do to unite Iran and
Yeah.
the West
Yeah.
against a common foe? But that's a bit at odds with sort of this idea that there kind of is this, I guess, like political Marxism that's being embraced, if not sort of deep ideological Marxism, because I thought maybe some of it would be coming out of just pure kind of geopolitical goals. In other
Mm,
words, we are opposed to the West,
mm,
and there is at least sort of this superficial element of saying you kind of have the oppressor versus oppressed narrative, and we are
mhm,
victims of colonialism from European powers beforehand. So we can sort of like see ourselves in this role.
mhm.
And it would be nice to cozy up to the other superpower during the Cold War. If we're not going to be on the US side, maybe say some things in favor of the other side, just so we have somebody on our side.
Yeah.
Um, did you do you have any sense of that? Is there a geopolitical calculation in sort of embracing that?
Potentially, but it, I should stress that Marxism in this time period was very popular. So, and I've personally read this myself, but it's not so strange to have people with Islamist training, like they became politically Islamist, who also were influenced in some capacity, maybe at a slightly earlier stage of their life, or maybe not, by left wing ideas as well. In terms of the geopolitics of it, it's kind of tough to tell because the Ayatollahs in Iran come to power almost at the exact same time as the Soviets invade Afghanistan. And right from the get go, Khomeini talks about his support for the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union. So, maybe a what if historian could be interested in hypothesizing what would have happened potentially if the Soviet Union had not invaded Afghanistan and there was a subsequent jihad against the Soviet invasion. How would the relationship of the Soviet Union look like with the Ayatollahs, who are at loggerheads, very serious loggerheads with the Soviet Union's enemy in America? I would think that it would be a much more cordial, much more friendlier relationship than it ended up being. But I guess we'll never be able to know.
Yeah. Okay. So let me get to another one we had come in that I started. Al Andalus. When the Umayyads collapsed in Spain, do you know how the Muslims or Arab/Berber communities survived after the Spaniards took over the caliphate?
How did they survive? So the Umayyads are collapsing just before the Taifa period. So the Umayyad Khilafah collapses like 747, I think, the OG one. But then in Al
It lives
Andalus,
on in Spain.
exactly, up until about the beginning of the 11th century, if I remember correctly. And then after that, it gets fragmentalized into petty city states, the Taifas, so to speak. Do you know how the Muslims survived? Well, first of all, you got to remember the Muslims were the majority all the way up until, I mean, the breaking point. A lot of historians like to look at Toledo, I think 1085, 1086. But up until that point, they were the vast politically dominant power on the Iberian
Iberia.
Peninsula.
Yeah.
So I don't think survival was their number one concern. In fact, they probably never even thought about survival at all. Like they were the dominant ones. Why would you think about survival? Um, it's only afterwards, as the Reconquista gains momentum and the petty states start fighting between themselves whilst the Reconquista is taking land from them. And then to further complicate matters, from Morocco, you've got Berber powers like the Almoravids first and then the Almohads, who invade the Iberian Peninsula from Morocco, that further complicate matters, that the Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain and Portugal, start having to worry about their survival. But for most of it, they were ruled by Muslims, and for a lot of it, they were the dominant power. So survival wouldn't necessarily have even crossed their minds.
Yeah, and I mean, you just have the kind of brutal Reconquista and expulsions and stuff. So
Yeah,
not
Comes
everybody
up.
survived, or people were just kicked out.
Yeah.
I guess this is touching a bit on what I was bringing up. Nono
Yeah.
says communism inherently anti-imperialist.
Mhm.
Could also be appeal for Muslims in former colonized states.
That was that's a very good point. That was one of the most appealing aspects of not just communism, but just left-wing ideas in general in the Islamic world. Because
But I think some of that is also late 20th century, like Franz Fanon, like post-colonial kind of Marxist theory inflecting that. Interestingly, Marx wrote positively about British rule in India. He saw it as like a changing tide there, which later Marxists say, he got that one wrong. But but yeah, I mean, I think it is, whether or not it starts out as that, I don't think the people at the top of the Soviet Union can be categorized as anti-imperialist, but there is kind of a again, sort of like a superficial, and also this sort of grows in academia throughout the 20th century. It's just this idea of like applying the Marxist lens to colonial relations and looking at the the proletariat as almost like a countrywide thing. So the idea that you now have today of say the global south is no longer the dynamics within a country, but it is dynamics between countries, which can sometimes be like a blunt instrument to try to get at what's going on there, but sort of
but
a
then
motivating
when the
ideology.
Soviets invade Afghanistan, it becomes even more difficult to try to rationalize and justify communism as an anti-colonial, anti-imperial force, because they're literally doing the same thing.
Right. Yeah, I know.
Right.
I saw some comments on your video too of some people. It's almost a cliche in some. I think like Soviet Union apologists. It's almost a cliche to say like whatever they do, you see it today actually. Whatever they do is simply a reaction that they were forced into by the West.
Yeah, not so much in Afghanistan. I don't know about other countries.
They killed they killed the president, took over. Like, I know you
I will
said
say they were very, very reluctant. They were very reluctant. Like all the way, they basically they invaded. I think it's Boxing Day, 1979. So that's December 26th. Basically, until the beginning of December that year, they were essentially saying no. Yeah, they just did it at the last moment.
But the fear is that you had a popular rebellion against the communist regime, and then you would kind of have a destabilized nation on your doorstep if you let it fall. Is that fair, accurate?
Yeah,
fair representation.
Yeah, essentially.
All right, got a question.
What, do we have another one?
Yep.
This is just so broad. What do you think is the most important event in Islamic history?
Dude, what the hell? The most important event? Well, I like to think of myself as quite a logical thinker, and logic will tell me that the first thing is always the most important thing, because everything that happens after wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the first thing. So it would probably be something right at the beginning, to be honest. Like, I'm talking about the Prophet's lifetime. to be honest. Like, it's probably one of the early battles, to be fair. Fought with like a couple hundred men, but the Battle of Uhud, maybe Battle of Badr, like 624, 626, those ones. If you're looking for really juicy events, I don't know. Oh, I'll give you one juicy event. This doesn't answer the question, by the way, but it's a underrated juicy event, and people should know about it way more. The Pruth River campaign, I believe. 1710, 1711, 1712, 1709, something like that, where even before Russia becomes a Tsardom, Peter the Great. Did you guys know, by the way? You guys know who Peter the Great is?
Yeah.
Did you guys know Peter the Great was at least 6'7"?
How much
That's
taller
like-
is that than the average height at the time?
That's like
Dude,
that's being like
he was-
7'2" nowadays.
he
Yeah.
went to, because he was very deeply interested in modernization, westernization. He wanted Russia, Muscovy, to become like Britain, the Netherlands, etc. He did a little tour of Western Europe. I don't know if he went to England, but I know he went to the Netherlands. And apparently it was really difficult to try to keep it on the down low, because there's a guy, and the Dutch, I'm pretty sure they're not the shortest people on planet Earth. I'm pretty sure they're famous for being tall themselves. This guy would just stick out like a sore thumb from everybody. But he was humongous, apparently. Anyway, before he becomes Tsar Peter I, he's having a war. I think it's the first Great Northern War between Sweden, which everybody forgets Sweden was a badass power for about 60, 70 years. He's having a war with the Swedes, and the Swedes basically join an alliance with the Ottomans, and they're having a battle, the Ottomans and the Swedes, against the Russians. I don't know where Pruth is. I'm guessing it's around like modern day Moldova or something like that. And the Tsar Peter, before Tsar Peter, is clearly losing, and the Ottomans win the battle. And all they need to do is just do a final melee to kind of stamp him out, and they just kind of turn back and go, we don't take him seriously enough. So he escapes, and then over the next 1710, over the next 200 years, the Russians become the primary pain in the backside for the Ottomans. So
That's a
Can you
fun
ima-
alt history.
you see what I'm saying? Like, can you imagine if that hadn't taken place?
Okay, so I just wanted to ask one last question here, and then we'll wrap up. But what's the biggest misconception about Islamic history? You know, to people who are kind of unfamiliar with it, what do you think they come in with? Sort of a, I don't know if it's a bias or just sort of a general flawed
That's
way of approaching it. Do you think there is a single answer to that question?
That's a really big and very good question. The only thing that's coming to my mind, and I'm sorry it's not that juicy, because you could probably apply this to any other region's history as well, is that the Islamic world's history is a lot more. Actually, you know what? I'm quite happy with this answer. It's a lot more nuanced than people think, right? Especially nowadays. Consciously, subconsciously, we're all human beings, so don't feel too bad about this. Because of the perception that the media in the Western countries has perpetuated of certain Islamic countries in the here and now, it has naturally, don't feel too bad, it has naturally colored your vision of that part of the world. I will overcompensate to the degree where I will share with you. You know, when those kind of terror attacks were happening in Europe and America, let's say the 2000s, in London, when I would get on a bus and I would see a dude with a big beard and a big backpack, it's not like I would get off the bus and it's not like it would be the first thought in my mind, because like I'm from that part of the world. A big beard is not strange to me. In fact, I'm kind of going in that direction too. But it would cross my mind. So don't feel too bad. This is very natural. Western media, you should feel very bad. Anyway, those kind of things have colored, and then the other one, by the way, actually, you know what? But this kind of goes hand in hand with what I was saying. One of the most interesting things you learn is about the Islamic world's relationship with tolerance. Again, unfortunately, media plays a role in this. You have a lot of people have this belief that Islamic societies are not exactly the most tolerant, especially when you look at how tolerant Western liberal societies have been over the past 100, 150 years. But you will be shocked to find out just how tolerant Islamic societies have been throughout history. Maybe in the more recent history, not so much, I will concede, but throughout most of it, tolerance was pretty high. And if you want to be competitive and relative and compare it to Europe, the Islamic world's tolerance in comparison to Western Christendom, like Western Europe, was not even comparable up until about the 17th, 18th, 19th century. It was by a factor of 10 minimum, much more tolerant than most Western European countries. And I've spent a little bit of time studying Western European history as well. So that's probably, actually, I like that better. The nuanced one is too generic. The biggest misconception about Islamic history is just how tolerant it has been.
Yeah, I think also that is a case of kind of taking a modern lens or looking at sort of like an Islamist power today and going, okay, that's what Islamic society is like. And you just back apply that to the 7th century and then basically have a pretty good idea of what things were like.
Exactly.
Yeah, even with even if you look at early sources on medieval Baghdad, it's sometimes like, especially coming from a Western point of view, it's shocking how almost like Romanesque it is in ways. Like you have these multiple trade ports. They had these different as an artist. I look for when a civilization has different guilds of art forms, because it shows how prosperous it is if you have time to actually form guilds and study and learn those different art forms. And they were copying like Chinese art, like they were copying the way that they did their pottery and stuff, and just how, I don't know, how diverse it was as well was very shocking looking into medieval Baghdad.
Well, and I think I was thinking.
Sorry, Chris, go on.
Well, I was just thinking too that one of the things that sort of gets back applied is kind of people are looking at the superpowers nowadays, and they go, okay, well, look how powerful Europe has been for the last 100 years or so, and almost assuming that's the way things were, when in actuality, for much of the medieval age, like the Ottomans, that's the superpower. That is, there's not. I think there is some sense of like post-colonial. Look at the Islamic world. This is sort of the position they've been in all of this time. But no, like medieval age, the age of exploration is partially spurred on by we can't trade with the East overland because the Ottomans are in the way. Like we need to just go in that direction. Maybe some things across the ocean. And it's just like you actually do have these superpowers. I always love delving into these societies where you kind of, or civilizations where maybe it challenges the previous notion that you have, where, we do a lot of Native American stuff. And so Native Americans, you end up, the thing that sticks in people's mind is reservations and sort of displacement and things like that. Just back it up like a century, and you just see like who's the empire, might not be the right word, but like who is the huge power in this world, and how complex are those institutions and stuff like that. And so it's like, I think that's the big thing that gets misapplied. Is like you don't need to view you don't need to view the Ottomans as sort of the kind of weak power before Europe, and then they were eventually conquered. Like, no, there's a time where it was the other way around.
That's a very good point, Chris. Actually, yeah, I quite like that answer. And the thing is, you can go further with what you said, and break it down further into the very structure of the society. Like, if you made the argument, okay, just because the Ottomans had a big army or a competent big army, that's not necessarily a wholly positive reflection on their civilizational standard, if I'm allowed to say that. I like to look more at, and maybe Joe would be more interested in this, I like to look more at more mundane stuff about the way in which a society runs smoothly, right? So not that many people go hungry. The rule of law is respected. Harvest, there aren't too many missed harvests if it is in human control, etc., etc. Even if you look at some of these Islamic civilizations from that perspective, okay, from a modern perspective, with modern institutions in the UK, they have a healthcare system, which loads of Brits like to complain about, but it is remarkable if we look at it objectively. Maybe it doesn't compare to modern standards, but by 16th century, 12th century, 9th century, 17th century, 13th century standards, if we look at some of those things that those Islamic societies were able to achieve, it's very difficult for you to not have some degree of respect to that. Like, I'll leave one little nugget of information if you guys didn't know about this. It's called a kulliye, Kullie. So you boys, have you boys ever been to Istanbul?
Just as a layover.
Yeah, connecting flight.
Okay, I'm sure as history
Great
fans,
airport, amazing airport.
it is the Ataturk one. Yeah, it is actually quite a nice airport. But I'm sure you guys are going to go to Istanbul at some point in your life as history fans. When you go there, you got these beautiful mosques from the Ottoman Golden Age, the classical architecture, right? Süleymaniye, Blue Mosque, in Edirne, the city on the European side, the Selemiye. When people look at them, if they're not history fans, I understand why they wouldn't do this. They see nice, beautiful mosques. However, in reality, most, in fact, if not all of those mosques, served as part of something known as a kulliye. A kulliye would be a complex of buildings / institutions which would include, in addition to a beautiful mosque, a soup kitchen. There would be some sort of a charitable endowment, whether it's one of the pillars of Islam, the zakat, where you give money to poor people. There might be a school for orphans associated with that. There might even be, I don't know what you would call this, a workshop, a class for, I don't know, old women to sew or something like that who need a bit of money. But there would be a bunch of institutions which had the singular aim of lightening the burden on some of the less haves, not haves. What's the phrase?
Have nots.
Have nots. Thank you. The have nots in society, right? And obviously, there's going to be a limit as to how many people this is going to be able to affect. But we're talking about a decent number of people. This is like on a yearly basis, this would affect tens of thousands of people positively, right? I look at that and I think, wow, that is a symbol of your civilizational standard. Armies, weapons, those things are very cool, nice. I like looking at maps of empires, how much they've conquered, etc. But those are the things that I personally believe allow an empire to be able to sustain itself over a long enough period of time. And so even if you break it down, those things were quite remarkable. I mean, a lot of people know that when North European, mainly French, but I think a couple of Brits as well, some of them, I think monks mainly, would go to Al-Andalus and they looked at the libraries in Cordoba, Toledo, these kind of areas, and they went back to where they were in shock, right? So once you see it from that lens, it's tough not to be interested in Islamic history. And I think what Chris said is a very, very good point. Don't look at it from just today's perspective. I know that's really difficult to do because we are surrounded by the present, the here and now. But don't just look at it from that lens, because most of Islamic history up until the 19th century was a lot different to what it is now.
Yeah, I mean, even just beyond Islam too. I mean, you just have, think about how we think of Iran today, which is like they're kind of kept around because they have nukes. Like but other than that, it's not a terribly advanced or terrifying army. It's not really a superpower. But just that region of the world, during the time of Islamic rule, but also beforehand, in the Greek times, like that is a super center of the world right there, like historically speaking.
Yeah.
And you know what, Chris? Sorry, you made a very poignant point, and I want to add to it. I believe, I don't know how to tangibly break this down, but I think when you read history enough, you get this thing that I'm about to say. I believe in historical trauma. I believe in historical civilizational standards. For example, meaning the example you gave of Iran. If a country has achieved incredible things in the past, I don't know how exactly tangibly, I don't have the words for it, but I think that carries over into the present some way, somehow. In the case of Iran, for example, one of the things that I am blown away, this does not mean that I'm a fan of the Ayatollah's politics. One of the things I'm personally blown away by is Iran's been under sanctions for 45 years, yet it's surviving. Dude, if the UK was under the level of sanctions that Iran has endured for less than 10 years, the UK's economy would collapse. I don't even need to know about economics to figure that out. So that in and of itself, whilst I get it from a civilizational standard, you're not producing art, you're not producing new ideas, etc., whatever. But just that thing alone, that trait that they have, whatever that is, resilience, whatever you want to call it, that's noteworthy. And I think delving into a country's past and learning about all of the nice episodes of their history and then also their trauma as well makes you understand their present situation much better.
I mean,
when we went to Mongolia. Oh, were you going to say the same thing?
What, bring up Mongolia?
Yeah, I was going to bring up Mongolia. And the whole, like, when you go there, you see Genghis Khan is everywhere. I mean, he's on restaurants, he's on vodka, he's everywhere. And part of that is also because of Soviet oppression and, trying to quash any cultural identity. So there's a resurgence of it. But it is like interesting because this is a small nation now, but it used to own a third of the world. And you kind of see that in the way they revere Genghis Khan as the great unifier of the tribes and stuff.
Yeah, there's almost no focus on being a conqueror there. It's all we went and watched basically like a horse. It's like an acrobatic horse show, but it was a play as well, and it covers the rise of Genghis Khan. And then, like, right when you're like, okay, here's where the conquests start, that's when it ends. And that's like people are cheering. There's little kids like jumping up and down. We got a picture with the guy playing Genghis Khan. And we were just like, oh, that's the difference there. It's like he's national identity for them. They don't normally ever think about the Khwarezmian Empire or what his descendants did in Baghdad or the Ilkhanate. Like that's he almost derives some power from being able to do that, the lineage, but the idea of being a nation founded on that and having, like as you said, sort of like the standard is up there is very important, especially in the post-Soviet time where They are a democracy that is landlocked between Russia and China, which is not a very fun place to be. And so having that standard there is like that's your lodestar. That's what you need to that's like a rallying point for your history. So
Yeah, and for the West, viewing Genghis Khan is you essentially see him as he's more of a military icon. You know him as, blood, steel, conquest. But when you go to Mongolia, it's like they just have so much pride in just simply before the conquest, like how they built that identity. And I think that's kind of an error that a lot of people, in America or the UK, in the West in general, view other cultures only through what was their military material impact in the world.
I would guess Afghanistan, is there a sense of almost being like a rebellious against foreign invasion, like sort of a very stubborn populace? Would you say that's kind of sort of in the national character to sort of resist outside invasion?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the history, it's a symbiotic relationship, essentially. It feeds into each other. The history feeds into the pride, and the pride feeds into the history, essentially. But you can even just break this down. If you guys have ever had any run-ins with Afghans, they tend to be a little bit more proud. You got to be a little bit more mindful of how you act and talk, not in a walking on eggshells with a sensitive person type, but you just got to make sure that you don't they don't interpret anything you do as disrespect, right? Because it's a very important concept for them. Whereas certain other cultures, they might have a lot more. And I'm not saying this is inherently a bad or a good thing. I've obviously chosen. I didn't have a choice because I was born an Afghan. But I'm not making a value judgment. Obviously, these things are formed over multiple different factors. But loads of other cultures, they might approach things with matters of pride in, if not a different way, because I think pride is a human emotion. It's not just exclusive to Afghans, obviously, but with a little bit more patience and things like that. Whereas with Afghans in general, from their history and then even the way their society is built, like telling them what to do, you can tell them what to do, but it has to be done in a certain way. You see what I'm saying? First of all, if you're a foreigner, you can't really tell them what to do, with all due respect. You can if it's like a technical material issue, like if I'm working in a factory, for example, and my boss is not Afghan, I'm just going to defer to his authority, obviously, because whatever. But if it's about like a world view, if it's about like a cultural understanding of something, then you can't really impose your views on me. And me personally, I can just talk for myself. I'm quite happy with that way of thinking. I'm quite sure of who I am. So a lot of it comes down to that. If a foreign power, by the way, maybe some Afghans wouldn't want me to say this, but if a foreign power went into Afghanistan and they didn't touch their religion or culture, they would have a lot more success than history has shown them to have. It's just when you kind of get into the culture and the religion, specifically religion, whatever you do, stay away from religion. Don't even get close to it. Stay a mile away from that. But even like cultural viewpoints, like just stay away from it, because obviously everybody has different views about everything. But please don't think I think what I think because I am incapable of thinking, or I have a lower IQ. I'm very sure of what I think. I don't need, the worst manifestation of this in the 19th century was the white man's burden to civilize sub-Saharan Africa and India. I don't need anyone else's help to figure out what I think about life. That's basically it.
So you're saying the Mongol rule is better, like Ilkhanate,
but the Mongol
worship.
But the history speaks for itself. The Mongol rule was a lot more successful than the Soviets were, and I know this is all relative, The Mongols
Yeah.
didn't have a nuclear weapon. The Soviets did. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You can make an argument that the Mongols had
The
a
Mongols
medieval
were the nuclear
The horse was
They
there.
were, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
As long as you don't
Well,
touch
this was
the
really
culture,
fun.
you'll be okay.
This was really fun, Tarek. Thanks so
Thank
much
you.
for joining. Thank you all for the questions. And hopefully we can do this again someday.
Boys, I had a lot of fun, and I didn't want to leave the podcast without saying this. I mean this genuinely. You guys are my favorite channel on YouTube.
Thanks so
The
much.
Thank you.
That's
no,
awesome.
I'm being dead serious. And I've tracked you guys from like the beginning of your channel, but the way in which you guys make history as engaging as you do is incredible. I don't know if you guys have a background in production and things of that nature, but I'm talking about, obviously I have a channel of my own, so I kind of hyper focus on this sort of stuff. But like even the little gaps in between when you're talking, you raise the music levels and the music you choose, and the Joe, your art is fantastic.
Thank you.
I've told everybody around me about your channel.
Awesome. That's
Please
great.
keep it
That's great to
awesome.
hear.
Thank you.
Thank you
Yeah.
so
Well,
much.
we love your channel too. It's I reached out because I'm just like, yeah, this guy, like, you just sometimes you watch somebody's channel and you're just like, this person is approaching it the right way, or even the way that like you would hedge a statement is a really good sign, because there are people that come out and say declaratively or everything seems to work toward a certain conclusion. And when you see like, once you have those statements like this may have been this, but this is a controversial. Now there were other viewpoints that like that's when I'm like, okay, somebody knows how to do research and they know how to present it, and you're not. Maybe that's a little bit of an Afghan trait that I've picked up. Like you're not trying to tell me what to think. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like,
Yeah. It doesn't work either, to be honest with you. Long term, it doesn't work. Thank you, boys.
All right, amazing.
All right. See you
Thank you.
guys.